Thank you for joining us for this webinar. Susie, do we need to start recording? Is this one that do I need to pause while you do it? Brilliant. I don't know why I even asked. Susie's always done it before I've even asked. So we are recording this if you wanted to listen to any of it afterwards. We will also send you some links to the kind of things that I'll be pointing to, and we'll send you the PowerPoint afterwards. So all of those will be coming. So this is an hour session. It's called a quick start webinar. It's basically a little kind of dip into what is quite a large, vast subject that, you know, we could and we do talk about for days on end. So this is really a kind of overview of why we think it's important, why it might be particularly important right now, with some little pointers to things that you might want to watch or read afterwards. So I am going to ask you to start off, if I can see the chat. Hopefully you can all access the chat. And if I move my slide on, I just want you to type a few words into the chat that describe your perfect learner. So if you think about a class that you've taught today, you know, generally for me, there's always one or two that kind of stand out, that whatever you throw at them, well, I won't even prompt you. What do you think? What do you think describes the perfect learner? I'm looking for a few descriptions here. Also, this does check that my microphone's working, I guess. Oh, okay. Oh, we've got a few that have gone to Susie, so we need to get everyone. Yeah, when you add it to the chat, if you check that it's going to everyone, not just Susie, otherwise I won't be able to see it. Brilliant. Keen to learn, curious. I love the word curious. Listen carefully, persevere, resilient, reflective, interested, engaged, motivated. Yeah, a lot of proactive is a word that basic needs. Oh gosh, yeah, that's really important, Kate, you know, to be actually in a position where they can begin to learn, because we know that really the classroom is just part of the picture there. Willing to engage, focus, tries their best. I agree. And what I started to say and realized that I was beginning to prompt you too much was that in every class that I teach, there's usually a couple at least of children in there that whatever you throw at them, they'll run with it, you know, and if they can't do it immediately, they'll keep trying. And if they don't do it perfectly the first time, they'll think about what went wrong and what they could do better next time. And they're the ones that it's very tempting to think that that children are born like that. Oh, he's just good at chemistry, you know, he's just really good. And what I say quite often is, one of the key messages from the Metacognition Self-Regulation Guidance Report from the EEF is that these things weren't necessarily things that came naturally, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But metacognition, self-regulated learning for me, they're at the heart of these questions that I found myself asking myself quite a lot when I was teaching. Things like, what's the point of correcting mistakes if by they I mean the children, if children I teach do the same thing next time? And if you've never pulled your hair out with absolute exasperation because you have said the same thing over and over again and still it happens, then you're a much better teacher than me. But this was one of the things that I used to really get exasperated about. And the other thing was, what's the point of helping children to do something really well if they can't do it when I'm not there? You know, we spend so much time helping, cajoling, supporting, scaffolding, learning. And at one point, we know that in some situation, we're not going to be there to do that. And sometimes it's purely, you know, standing there and saying, come on, you can do this. There's a reason that, you know, sports events, people run faster when they've got crowds cheering them on. There is something in that, having those people around you. And sometimes it's being able to apply those things that they learned last Monday to a different situation on Wednesday the week after. So for me, metacognition and self-regulated learning is getting to the heart of this independence and being able to transfer and apply learning within different contexts. And I think if there's ever been a time where it's come home to us, been brought home to us, how much we do this without even thinking, it's been the last 6 months. And this is a slide actually that was used in a webinar from Kingsbridge Research School about remote learning. And their point here was all the kind of thoughts that we have when we're teaching. So, you know, thinking, well, that one's doing quite well, they can probably get on with this, whereas someone over here probably needs another worked example. That one seemed to, she or he seemed to struggle with that question. And there's so much that we do as teachers. You know, we see that glazed look and we kind of think, oh, I better just, you know, ramp up what I'm saying or bring them their attention back, or the terrified look in someone's eyes, and you think I'd better just go over and see if I can support them. Sometimes we are scaffolding this self-regulation so much without even realizing it. And the skill of teaching and supporting this in children is to recognize what it is that we're doing and kind of distill it and help students or children to do that themselves. So going back to this perfect learner, yes, there are some children that when even before we started to teach them seem to be really resilient. They seem to be able to answer things. They seem to try even when they find it difficult. They seem to be able to draw on resources and things that they did last week. And then there are others that don't seem to be so adept at doing this. And it's quite tempting, as I've said, to think that this is something that just developed naturally and so is just more organized, for example. Actually, the organization one is a really good example for me, because I would say I'm pretty disorganized, but in a work, thanks Susie, you're supposed to say no you're not, but in a work situation I have to be organized, right? I mean, you can't. So for example, every day when I come into school I have to wear a lanyard. If I don't wear a lanyard, I have to go to reception and ask them to give me one. It's, you know, it's part of our safeguarding thing that I have to wear a lanyard. Because I know that it's so important, I have various strategies that I use to make sure that my lanyard always goes away in the same place, that I always take it out of my bag at the same point in the day, and that I always put it back in the same place. It's a really little thing, but it helps me. So it's not that I'm naturally or badly or well organized. It's that sometimes there are strategies that we learn to put in place. And I've had sixth form tutor groups before, and they also have to wear lanyards, and it's also something that they forget quite often. And just those little tips that we give without thinking, sometimes explicitly giving those strategies is enough to help someone kind of prompt them into that thinking. And that goes for learning as well. Before children even encounter us, there will be a certain amount that they have encountered outside of lessons that help them to develop those skills that we've been talking about with that perfect learner. Sometimes they will have been explicitly taught. You know, there will be situations where, for example, my son does swimming. He swims for a club, and sometimes they have to just get out of the pool, however upset they are, and get back in again and do a race, even if they're really upset because they've just been disqualified. So they give them the strategies and those kind of mindsets that so sometimes there will be things that children have done before they've even come into the lesson. Sometimes it'll be modeling behaviors. We did some training a couple of years ago, and the head of West Earlham Infant School, Sarah Mardell, was talking about the modelling that they do of behaviours that the children in their school haven't necessarily encountered at home. Things like I've got to remember to do all these things, so I'm going to write them down so that I remember. You know, a strategy that we would probably do without thinking, but they might not have necessarily seen at home, especially if they're in a come from a household where people are less confident about reading and writing. It might not be one of the strategies they've used. Sometimes these behaviours will have been modelled by people outside of the classroom. Sometimes it will be inside of the classroom. So yeah, sometimes it will be role models at home, and sometimes there will be specific materials that support children before we even meet them. But we know, and especially thinking about this, coming at this with the outlook of the Education Endowment Foundation, which was set up specifically to try and break the correlation between disadvantage, however we frame that, and educational outcomes. There will be some children that we teach that haven't had as much of this outside of lessons. And those children are the ones that will benefit the most from us explicitly teaching metacognitive and metacognitive skills and self-regulation. They are the ones that are going to, there are some that will fly whatever we do. But for the ones that find it more difficult, they are the ones that will benefit most from thinking about what we mean by this and developing ways of specifically supporting. So self-regulated learning, actually it's an umbrella term for three things really. We've got the cognition, we've got the what it is, the stuff, the strategies, the knowledge, that, you know, you can't actually think about what you're learning and modify it if you don't have that knowledge to call on in the first place. So cognition is one of the terms that is needed for a self-regulated learner. Then we have metacognition. So the metacognition is the thinking about that cognition, so thinking around that. And then the bit that I think people forget quite easily, but I think some people would argue it needs to be in place, you know, before any of this, the other things can take place, is motivation. You know, I think some of us use that word in the chat, those motivated children that will try again, that really want to learn. Keen, somebody said keen, you know, those children that really want to do it, that's a key part of that self-regulation. If we don't want to learn, if we don't really care about why we're doing it and don't really understand the purpose of it, it actually is going to be very difficult to kind of get the cognition and the metacognition to kick in. But the metacognition is the aspect that we're going to focus most on today in the context of self-regulated learners. And there's a definition here, which is the ability to use prior knowledge to plan a strategy for approaching a learning task, take necessary steps to problem solve, reflect on and evaluate results, and modify one's approach as needed. So a lot to take in there, but it's basically something about planning, something about kind of monitoring what you're doing at the time, and then something about evaluating and changing. And I think one of the first things to say is we do this all the time, right? I mean, for me to get sat at this desk at 4 o'clock ready to start talking into a webcam, I had to kind of think backwards. I had to think, well, I've got to do all this beforehand. I've got to make sure this is done beforehand. Then I was all on track, and Roger came in, my line manager, and started talking to me about something as I was in the midst of doing something else. So I was thinking, oh, now I've got to change this, and I've got to, you know, we're constantly monitoring what we're doing, making decisions, changing, so that we get to an end point. That you know, that's something that we do as part of life. But the key point with metacognition from the EEF's review of this, from their guidance report, is that metacognition is something that can be explicitly taught, or the skills can be explicitly taught. And the reason I've got a rowing boat down there is because it's an example, and I apologise if you've heard me, Susie's heard this a million times, but so I just love this example to kind of show how important context is. Because I want you to imagine that you're standing on that jetty there, you can see at the bottom, and you want to get into that rowing boat, and the rowing boat is just a short distance from the jetty here. And so you know that a really good strategy for getting from one place to another with a gap in between is to jump. So you stand on the jetty and you jump into the rowing boat. And probably, so that was your plan, you called on a strategy that you've used before, you called on your knowledge, your cognition, I know that this is a good strategy. And then as you do it, the rowing boat obviously begins to kind of wobble and possibly you end up in the water. So as you're doing it, you might be thinking, gosh, this wasn't a great strategy. What can I do next time? And your evaluation might be, well, next time I might hold the boat and I might step into it, because that's another strategy that I've used in another situation that would be better here. So going back to this slide here, this cognition is really, really important. I've just talked about two strategies there to get over a gap. One of those wasn't successful, jumping. The other one was more successful, stepping and holding onto the thing but you need that cognition there in the first place. That has to be taught before you can then do the metacognitive bit, which is to think, well, I could draw on this strategy. Oh, this wasn't as great as I thought it was. I'll try another one next time. So just to to make sure you're all still there, no, I don't mean that. Just to see how you're thinking about things like this. What I've got here is a Google form, and I'm just putting the link into the chat. And so hopefully you can see there, you can either click on it directly, or you can use the bit.ly. And if you could put that into a browser somewhere, what you should find is that there's a form to fill in about whether you agree or disagree about certain statements around metacognition. So I'll just mute myself while you do that. So as you begin to share your results, we can begin to look at some of them. And you'll see actually they've been added to some from a previous session. So I think about a quarter of these are yours. So this is kind of people's opinion. Another name for metacognition: thinking skills, can be applied to a range of contexts, could be described as thinking about thinking. We're pretty, people seem to think that's a sure thing. Particularly valuable for low prior retainers. Oh, it's going up. Yep, thank you. Still submitting, which is brilliant. Yeah, we've got some agreement there. Most helpful for older children. We've got a disagree there. University undergraduates tend to have well-developed metacognitive skills. Okay, kind of half and half there. Metacognition skills are context specific. Okay, so the ones that we were most sure of is this kind of thinking skills at the top, and that seems to have agreed even as people are adding things there. So let's just go back to here. And the reason I'm asking you about those, there's two reasons. We're gonna be talking about metacognition teaching strategies later, and one of the first things is we talk about activating thinking. So as much as anything, what I was trying to do there is to get you thinking about this stuff before I then start to talk about it. So I could have just gone straight into 4 myths about metacognition, but we know that if you actively think about something first, it helps you to kind of engage with it and hopefully learn a bit more from it. So these were basically to pick out a few of the myths around metacognition. And one of the common myths about metacognition is that it's only developed in older pupils. And I would say definitely not so. If any of you here are early years practitioners, first of all, hands off, my hat's off to you, because I think what you do is amazing. And I have very little expertise in this area, but all I do know is that younger children are very, very metacognitive in what they do. You know, if you've ever seen a small child kind of build up a tower or try to build some blocks and they fall over and think again about what they're doing, they are constantly learning and evaluating and re-evaluating what they do. It might take a different form. It might be that you prompt and scaffold in different ways. You know, one of the examples we have from a nursery school that we've talked about before is just kind of looking outside at the weather and saying, oh, you know, it's quite rainy out there, so which coat shall I choose? I will put my coat on. Shall I put my boots on? You know, all those kind of decisions that you make, that might be very different to an exam wrapper that you use with an A-level class, but it's still, you know, planning around those thought processes, and it's just as valuable for them. And actually that question about university students is an interesting one, because they must have developed some pretty good metacognitive self-regulation, because otherwise I guess they wouldn't be at university, but they're not necessarily very good at metacognition. For example, one of the recommendations is around study skills, and university students don't necessarily know the most effective way to study. So this isn't something that we kind of write off at any point. Is a general skill that can be separated from subject knowledge. Okay, yes, but it certainly, what we know about metacognition and metacognitive skills is that they are much more effective if they are taught within a subject-specific context or within context. So there are some general skills that we're going to talk about soon: the planning, the monitoring, evaluating, and as I've said, that could actually be related to any situation that you kind of find yourself in during the day. But for example, planning to answer a long calculation in physics will be very different to the planning that you do to write a discursive essay in history. And the kind of essay skills, planning skills that you use in history will actually be quite different to the ones that you use in English, for example. So, and even within those different subjects, there'll be different situations where they're used differently. So yes, there are some general kind of umbrella terms, but what we know, and especially when we're talking about those disadvantaged learners who don't necessarily have well developed self-regulation already, they are the ones that will benefit most from this context-specific, subject-specific approach. It represents, so another myth is that it represents some kind of higher order thinking and it's more important than cognition. Well, as I said, you know, the rowing boat example, if I didn't have those strategies to call on in the first place, the metacognition, my evaluation of what was a good or bad strategy, wouldn't have been effective anyway. So we need that cognition, the knowledge, and the knowledge of strategies and approaches needs to come first. We're not saying that one is more important than the other. And again, this is the kind of thing that people have done and still do. The EEF would argue from their guidance report that this is not something that should be separated as a specific kind of thinking skills lesson, but it would be much more effective if it was taught in context. So what do we mean by metacognition self-regulation, and what can we do to support it with our pupils? Well, we've talked a little bit about what it means. In terms of what we can do to support metacognition and self-regulated learning, there is a guidance report from the Education Endowment Foundation, the EEF, and it has 7 recommendations that for teachers and leaders as to how to support this. I would say that the yellow ones here on each end are more around the kind of school systemic things, so the kind of things, structures that you might put in place to support it, whereas the ones in the middle are more around the actual kind of classroom-based strategies. And so the first one that really comes up as a kind of teaching in the classroom recommendation is to explicitly teach pupils metacognitive strategies, including how to plan, monitor, and evaluate their learning. And so that's why in the original guidance report, they used this cycle to try and explain that. So we have this idea that we are planning an approach before we even start to do things, and we draw on our cognition to do this. And then as we do it, we're monitoring, and there's something about evaluating afterwards. They've kind of made this a little bit more complex now, just to kind of allude to the fact that we don't just have these planning, monitoring, evaluation skills alone. They can't work in isolation, but we need that knowledge there in the first place. So if you're given a task to do, you need to kind of know what that task is, what it is you've got to do, what the kind of strategies are that you could call on to do that, and also something about yourself. And I'll give a couple of examples to show what I mean by that. This is a passage in a different language. You might recognize what the language is. So even before you started, you're drawing on some kind of knowledge there to work out what that language is. You've probably seen, well, here we go, Plaid Cymru might be a bit of a giveaway here. So this is a passage in Welsh. And what I would do if I had any longer is get you to translate this. And think of the kind of strategies and approaches you might employ to do this. I mean, at first, I don't know about you, but I just look at this and wide-eyed and panic, because there's a load of consonants, a loads of kind of words I've never seen before. And it really, I mean, I speak other languages, but this is nothing like any of the other languages I speak. So that's my knowledge of self. I know I don't speak Welsh. However, already I've begun to kind of pick out some of these words that look familiar. I can see that this is probably a name, and then I've begun to get a strategy there. So I'm looking for other things that look like names, and so there would be a way in. Now, I guess my knowledge of self, do I really care about this? Am I motivated to do this? I guess it depends whether you were bribing me with chocolate or not. But, you know, there's something in there about not just what I know and what I'm going to do to try and do it, but also something that I bring to the equation as well. This is another one that I show quite often. We've got a lot of kind of very dense text here. So again, if I was asking you to try and make your way around this and understand what this was about. And I like this because I think quite often it's difficult to appreciate what it's like to be a child that is faced with text, with language that they don't necessarily understand. You know, in science, there's some fact that people use quite often, that you learn as many new words in Key Stage 4 science as you do in Key Stage 4 MFL, modern foreign languages. So there's language that people don't understand. There will be children that don't even read. They can decode, but they can't read as effectively as others. And so there will be different strategies that people call on depending on what their knowledge of this, you know, what they're bringing to it in the first place. So one of the things that you might do, for example, and you might encourage children to do, is just, you know, pick out the words you don't understand and look them up in a dictionary. Find those really key phrases that probably, you know, really hold the key to what this passage is saying. There will be strategies that you call on to do this. This is another one. Anyone want to give me an answer? Right, I shall give you 30 seconds, and then I'm going to ask someone how they've started to approach this. Sorry, I am. So how would you answer this question? Oh, that's really interesting, Kate. So concepts such as sustained shared thinking in early years are now understood to promote. Do you mind unmuting and just expanding on that? Because that's really interesting. Are you there, Kate? So So by sharing your thinking, you're talking about kind of verbalizing thoughts and things like that. I can't hear you at the moment. I can see you're unmuted. I'll tell you what, I'll come back to you because there will be a point, I think, where that's going to be really relevant, and I'll come and ask you then. Aha, right, Lisa, brilliant. You've given us a way in. All right, so that's good. Do you want me to, I think, do you want to explain that? Are you able to talk it through? Are you able to unmute yourself?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know why. I'm not someone who considers myself very mathematically astute, but I don't know why. I just thought to myself, that was what I was thinking first. I was thinking, like, what is the number which is the common denominator?
Yeah.
So that was what I thought.
Yeah, no, I agree, because arms different for octopuses and with tails on everyone, but we're assuming that all of them have 2 eyes, and then you can go from there. That's my starting point as well. When I did this recently with a whole load of teachers on different topics, it was really interesting that quite a few of them drew up a table. They actually sat there, you know, that was their approach, and that's another really good strategy. I've had one where they tried to do it with algebra, one of the maths teachers from our school. So everybody will have different, you know, strategies and knowledge that they bring to this, but the point is probably we'll get to the same point eventually together. And so our job as teachers, I think, is to teach those strategies, whatever context we're in, so that the children that we teach have them there to draw on. And we're talking about strategies here as opposed to the knowledge. So there's a certain amount of knowledge that you need to count, but here we're talking about a strategy to approach a problem. And so as teachers, we do a lot of this without even thinking. So, you know, we might be standing there saying, right, you know, where do we start? So that's a really good metacognitive question. Okay, what have you done before that looks a bit like this? What did you do last week that we could draw on? And what we want eventually is for our children, is the children we teach, to kind of do this themselves, to think, oh, now this looks a bit like what I did last week. But that's a very, you know, that's something that they have to develop, and sometimes we prompt that ourselves, you know, and then we're trying to think, okay, give some specific guidance here. Okay, so what do you know about, what can you do, try sentence by sentence, and then they've got the knowledge of self here. Okay, you know, this is why you want to do it, come on, it's challenging, you can keep, oh, this is the kind of thing that we would do if we're standing next to a child and we have that time to do it. But especially right now, there's going to be situations where even if they're in the same classroom with us, that we don't get the same opportunities to do this. And we're really kind of seeing how much of this stuff we do. So what we really want is to get to the point where we don't always have to be standing there thinking, oh, they need another works example, they need to think. No, that where the children that we teach start to do this themselves. But to do that, they actually need to know what those strategies are that they're going to call on in the first place. So yes, they need to be taught how to plan, monitor and evaluate, but what does that look like, and how do we teach it? How do we teach those strategies? And in the guidance report, they have a 7-step kind of learning sequence for teaching metacognitive strategies. Now, what I have to make very clear here is this is not a 7-part lesson. We're not going from like the 3-part lesson that we've kind of left behind to a certain extent and moving directly to a 7-part lesson. This is in the course of teaching something. So for example, I'm a chemistry teacher. There will be a certain strategy that the children I teach have to use to interpret the periodic table and find out some information about an atom, and then apply it to something else. Now, there's quite a lot that goes on in that, and it wouldn't just happen in one lesson. You know, first of all, I would be activating the prior knowledge about what the periodic table is, what the atom is, you know, and all those kind of, so that might be one lesson, or it might be a homework, or it might be a little quiz. You know, there's all sorts of ways I can get them thinking about this before I do it. And then teaching all the different strategies to do this would probably be several lessons worth. But within within that sequence of lessons, within that learning sequence, I would hope to kind of bring in some of these aspects to help them learn. And the reason I've got a picture of the cyclist at the bottom is to prompt another story that I've told countless times, apologies to Susie, but for me, this kind of shows how much of this stuff we do without thinking. So I cycle, and when I cycle, I sometimes have to turn right. And because we tend to cycle everywhere as a family, quite often I have my kids cycling behind me. So we'll be cycling along. So I cycle to school with them, and there's a right-hand turn that we have to do. And one of the things that I could do is just when I get to the point where I know it's safe to turn right, I could just say, right, everybody, turn right. And then they would follow me and they would be safe. And the objective of that particular journey, to get to school in one piece without being hit by a car, would have been successfully managed. But it wouldn't help them to become better cyclists. And oh my gosh, one day I hope they can do this without me. So that's what I'm kind of aiming for. And so as I cycle, and this is where you sometimes wonder why you say these things out loud, but I do. I speak out loud, and I cycle along and I say, okay, we're going to cycle, going to turn right in a minute. Okay, I'm going to look ahead now. There's no traffic coming that way. I'll just glance over my shoulder. Okay, I'm going to signal right. Okay, look again, nothing coming. Glance one more time. Okay, everybody turn right. And what I hope is those kind of thought processes that I have, that I know that I go through to turn right, will become so ingrained in their kind of psyche, and they would have practiced it so many times, that eventually they will be able to do it themselves. And so with the older ones, I begin to say, okay, what do you think? Can we go? You know, what do I need to do? It's the kind of thing that we do without thinking as teachers. But what we're saying is here, we can think about how to explicitly kind of put this in a learning sequence. So yeah, one of the first things to do is to activate prior knowledge. And what you can see, this diagram comes from the Metacognition guidance report. And at the start, we're very much teacher focused. You know, at the start, this is the teacher that's doing the thinking, really. They're trying to prompt it in, but it's led by the teacher. And then what we're trying to get to is a point where, you know, we get to the point where we're kind of hand in hand, kind of scaffolding some of that learning to the point where students are beginning to practice this on their own, and then they're able to take on a lot more of that learning themselves. That's what we're aiming for. But at the beginning, yeah, we need to kind of get them thinking about this stuff in the first place, activating prior knowledge. And that can be done in a range of ways. I mean, I did it using a true and false quiz at the start, or you might actually, a lot of people now are thinking about retrieval practice and kind of quizzes at the beginning of lessons, and so you might tailor those 5 questions that you ask routinely to the lesson and thinking about what they want to be thinking about. But this one I love as well, just the idea of sticking up a picture and getting children to write down as much as they know about it. So this one, for example, I've used in a physics lesson where you're talking about I've just forgotten the word, conduction. I've completely forgotten the word. Excuse me, where we're talking about why convection, that's the word I'm looking for, where we're talking about why it is that a hot air balloon rises, why it is that you have to heat the air before that hot air balloon will rise, why it is that when you just blow into a balloon, a party balloon, that doesn't rise. There's so many thoughts that could be stimulated from this one picture here. So it doesn't have to be just questioning people all the time. The point is to get them thinking. And also it doesn't have to be in the lesson, you know. Time is quite precious at times, so it could be if you set homework for the class that you're thinking about here, that you set a homework beforehand that gets them thinking about it, or, you know, there are lots of different ways this can be done, but we're thinking about what it is we're going to learn about. And then at one point, there are strategies that have to be explicitly taught. And we're saying at the start, this is quite teacher focused. And this is an example that I quite like, because I think if you're thinking about adding fractions here, I think if you're Key Stage 2 teacher, I think I'm right in saying this is a kind of year 3, year 4 kind of thing to do. And really to get to the point where you can add those together, there's so many little bits of thinking that we have to get in there. We have to first of all think about what a fraction is. So we have to kind of talk about what a half means, what a third means. And then we have to think about the fact that where actually a half can be, you know, 3 of these 6 boxes. And, you know, so what we're beginning to do is talk about common denominators, and then we can begin to get to the stage where we get to an answer. But what we're saying in the context of this explicit kind of teaching those strategies is that you need to split those sections up bit by bit and teach them, and make sure that you understand the bits that you do without thinking, get children to practice them, and then move on. Because at one point there will be a point where you've shown how to do something, and then you want to kind of hand over the reins, as it were, to the class that you're teaching. And that's where modelling comes in. And this can be in a whole range of ways. In fact, before I go on to that, I think possibly this is what Katie was getting at, and please correct me if I'm wrong, either come in on the microphone or on the chat. But there is something about modelling your thinking, talking about the decisions that you're going to make. One of the things that I do in teaching calculations in chemistry is to do calculations on the board. And one of the most terrifying things I do is to do this without having planned how I'm going to do that. And that means that when I come to talk through what I'm doing on the board, I have to be thinking about what I'm doing. And I try to verbalize those thoughts as I'm doing it. And there are so many points where you can go wrong in a chemistry calculation, and quite often I do. And so what the kids in the class see is me going, that's 10 times greater than I thought it should be. Come on, let's go back one stage. Where did I forget to divide by 10? Okay, where did I do that? Why didn't I convert the units there? What have I forgotten there? And all of those things, those modeling, those thinking, can be a really effective strategy, because there are things that you will do as an expert in the subject that you're teaching or without thinking. And those implicit actions, part of the skill of teaching is to make that explicit to the people you're teaching, so that they know they can get inside your head and do the same thing. And sometimes it's just as simple as, you know, modeling it by giving, for example, worked examples where you begin to take some of the support away. A lot of schools use the kind of I do, we do, you do. So you're starting off by explicitly teaching something, then you're modeling and supporting a class as they begin to do it themselves before you leave them to do it themselves. It's just different ways of looking at this kind of modeling and then taking the support away gradually. Because even after kind of modeling that strategy, possibly getting them to learn it, there will be a jump again where you need to still guide them over the next step. And that's where scaffolds come in, you know, these things like verbs that you might use for writing in a particular topic, or in science, we sometimes use these kind of writing frames, because sometimes in science we do some extended writing too. And this will be just little prompts that people use to frame their writing as they do it. But what I would say is a really key aspect of this is removing the scaffolding too. You know, what we're ultimately aiming to have is children that can do this when we're not there. And so at one point we have to make that transition from offering scaffolds to removing that and helping them to make that step. And we had a meeting last week about literacy in science teaching, and one of the observations that was made was that we're really good at offering prompts, offering these kind of prompts here, the kind of verbs, things that we can use. But what is really difficult, often because we don't have enough time, to be honest, and it is to kind of do that transition and manage it really well. It's really tempting to kind of go through this bit quickly because we want to get to the next stage, but if we can manage it well, that's the really powerful thing to do. And this is just a really nice example. This is an A-level example, so you know, we're going from one extreme to the other, but this is practicing how to compare things in biology. And what I mean, this is another science example, sorry, I didn't mean them all to be, but this is the kind of knowledge here is really well known by the time they get to this stage. They know about plant and animal cells. They know what all these words mean. What they don't necessarily know how to do is to compare them in a sentence. And so this is specifically around how to compare things rather than what those things are. And so eventually what you need to get to the point is basically where children get a lot of opportunity to practice these things on their own. And this shed loads of practice idea is something we've coined in a particular group I'm in, because I don't know if you've you know, that there was a temptation at one point, especially in textbooks in science, where you'd get everything just neatly. I could pick up any textbook actually from the shelf above me here, and they all have a topic very neatly on a double page. And they were so keen to get a topic on a double page with lots of lovely photos that then there were very few questions for each thing. And so actually the practice to get good at things kind of disappeared. And so really, and again, if we're pushed for time, which we often are as teachers, it's quite difficult, it's quite easy to kind of skip over this practice bit. But that is one of the bits that's really important to develop this independence, so that they can do this when we're not there. And the other bit that's really, really tempting to skip over is the reflection afterwards. And yet, if you think about, you know, going back to that plan, monitor and evaluate, that is a really key aspect of the metacognitive cycle. And if you think of that rowing boat example, if I hadn't done the evaluation afterwards and got wet, got to do something different next time, then I probably would have just jumped into the rowing boat the next time and made the same mistake. That evaluation is so important to develop as learners. And when we were talking about that perfect learner at the start, they probably are the ones that are quite good at reflecting on, you know, not just going, oh, I'm just really rubbish at chemistry, that's why I did badly in that test. They'll say, oh, do you know what, I forgot to revise that, or I should have spent a bit longer on that, or you know, that I actually talking to my son yesterday who got something wrong in maths, and I said, you know, why did you get it wrong? And he said, oh, I just forgot to check my work through. And it's a really, you know, but and maybe that wasn't what it was, but just that thought about what am I going to do next time? Well, next time I'll take that time to kind of think things through. And that's why sometimes we will specifically kind of structure this. So you can, for example, this is a kind of wrapper that goes around an A-level piece of work where, you know, they actually specifically ask prompt questions for students as they do it. Sometimes it can be really simple. I don't know about you, but especially with the kind of move online at the moment, I suspect there'll be people that are using a lot of these online quizzing things, which are brilliant, right? Because they reduce workload, they're done for us. We can get some feedback about what our what the students know and don't know. But what do students gain from that? What do the children gain from that? Are they actually getting to the end of a quiz and going, oh, I got question 8 wrong. Why did I get it wrong? Oh, it was because of this. And so sometimes it can be as simple as you set an online quiz, to set a form alongside that saying, which question did you get wrong? Why did you get it wrong? What are you going to do differently next time? You know, none of these are kind of, it's more about the thinking that you prompt rather than the what you actually do. So we have only got an hour, so I am only going to be dipping very quickly into the other recommendations, but just to point out, so recommendation 5, it's really worth having a look at this one, and I could never do it justice in you know, a part of an hour's webinar, but there is a recommendation around promoting and developing metacognitive talk in the classroom. Now, that is a very, very tricky, skillful thing to do well, and it's really worth looking at the kind of things that they recommend. There are some schools that are really good at this, the kind of oracy dimension, but that articulating thoughts and being able to discuss ideas is a really key part of supporting metacognition. you know, sometimes we do a lot of things written, but sometimes why did you do that? Why did you take that step in the calculus? Why did you decide to put a coat on? Oh, because it's raining. You know, whatever it is, articulating these thoughts can be a really valuable thing to do. And then the other two are around, first of all, setting an appropriate level of challenge. And for me, this kind of really goes alongside any work that you might have done around kind of cognitive science and cognition, and how we learn effectively, how we make sure that we are giving enough instruction to stretch our pupils and to help them learn more, but also not bombarding them with so much information that they become very quickly overloaded, or also not giving them something that's so easy that they're not really thinking hard, and then they don't develop that thinking as well as they would if you'd actually activated that hard thinking. So there's something there around the kind of Goldilocks idea. It's got to be hard enough but not so hard, and if you've done any kind of reading around Rosenshine's principles, that's a really kind of key explicit way of looking at some aspects of cognitive load, but there's also, if you wanted to look at the evidence-based education of literally recently just brought out a great teaching toolkit, and there's a lot in there about activating hard thinking and getting pupils to think, because it's not just about cutting everything out. Sometimes it's about, you know, actually increasing that load, that thinking time. And there's also something around explicitly teaching. So it's this explicitly teaching thing again, isn't it? That those things, you can't assume that this happens just by osmosis, just without, you know, sometimes it's good to kind of work out what it is that we want students to do and help them to do it. And I probably should have pointed out here actually that number 3 is around modelling your thinking, which is something that we talked about there. But this explicitly teaching, and this is about explicitly teaching them how to learn independently, because we've always, you know, there's always been a bit of this. I mean, some phases more than others. So if you teach Key Stage 5, you're going to be expecting a lot more kind of independent learning than you would if you're teaching, say, Key Stage 3 even, or, you know, possibly Key Stage 2 and 1 or whatever. But at the moment, where we're not always with the children that we teach, this is especially important, that they have those kind of independent learning skills so that they can manage their time effectively when we're not there. And just as an example of how badly you can do this, and this is an example from me, I mean, the first thing to acknowledge is that students or children don't necessarily know what's good for them. They don't necessarily know what effective study looks like. And if you, this is just a study from 2009 where they talked to students about how they revise for things. And these actually were university students, I think. So, you know, when we were talking at the beginning about university students having well-developed, you know, metacognitive skills and so on, actually a lot of what they did was just rereading their notes. That was what they did to revise. And what we know from looking at how we learn and how and so on is that this is not a very effective learning strategy. Effective learning strategies would be to retrieve information, for example, because that strengthens long-term memory and so on. But it feels nicer to read a book, and actually you feel more confident when you're reading a book than you do if you put that book away and then try and remember what was on the page. So people do tend to think they're learning more when they're rereading than they do when they're retrieving, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are. So there is something around teaching students to study effectively. And I've got to be honest, I used to set homeworks like this, you know, revise for a test next week on structure and bonding. Woohoo, job done. I don't have to think now until they come to the lesson next week. If I'm perfectly honest, that was a really nice, low key homework for me. Did they gain from it? Well, yes, some students did, right? Because some students were pretty good at revising. They knew how to do it. They probably had a lot of support at home. They probably had a quiet space to learn. And so that kind of homework for them was fine and they did really well. Did all of them? No, probably some of them turned up at the lesson thinking that they'd done lots of revision, having highlighted their notes in yellow highlighter and feeling, you know, they'd spent a lot of time on it. Was it effective? Probably not. And so, you know, then I began to think, oh, make flashcards to revise instead. But I would say even that wasn't a really great homework, because I'm still not helping them to think about how to use those flashcards, for example. So this example is from Holly Redding at Taveram, and they actually set homeworks where they are teaching Key Stage 3, and this is in RE, they're teaching them to actually, they're teaching them different revision, different study, different independent learning strategies as part of their homework. And they have always done this even before lockdown and all the things that kind of took us by surprise. And if you think about it, if we go back to that kind of knowledge of task, knowledge of self, knowledge of strategies, all of those things that plug into this self-regulated learning, there is a lot there that a student has to think through for themselves. You know, they have to be motivated enough for doing to do the task in the first place. It's not just a question of just here's something, get on with it, job done. So our job as teachers actually is to really kind of help them to play into this and learn how to learn what works best for them, I guess. And so this is all very well. There is a guidance report and you can download it, and you can ask Susie and she can send you a hard copy of it if you want to read that. It's a lovely guidance report. It's beautiful to look at and there's lots in there. But ultimately, with anything like this, I mean, this, I've said an hour today is like dip your toes in and just see what's out there. Ultimately, what we talk about a lot at the EEF is implementation, and so much of the benefit from this kind of thing doesn't so much come from knowing what it is and being able to kind of do strategies here and there. It's really kind of finding ways of embedding it within your teaching or across a department or within a school. And I think some really good examples to look at for people that have done things like that. First of all, and I said we'll send you the links for this. Tom Stevens, who's deputy head at Long Stratton, did a really good research ed talk that's on YouTube talking about how they've embedded and implemented metacognition within the school. Here we have a really, our head of RE is brilliant at this stuff, and she's been thinking about it for a while, and she wrote recently alongside Adam Pritchard, who's our research lead here, a really good blog post on how they've embedded metacognition within the RE department. And there's some really kind of key bits in here about making sure, you know, that she said here, sometimes including a really simple question like, have you made enough points to fully answer a question, can be a real breakthrough. And it's always surprising how many students benefit from this. There's, you know, those little things that we do without thinking. But there's also something in here about how they've made sure it kind of works in tandem and alongside the rest of their curriculum. So again, we'll send you the link to have a look at that. And just another example here, Lauren Stevenson is a physics teacher, but she's used some of the metacognitive strategies, some of the strategies from disciplinary literacy. And again, there's another guidance report on that if you want to read it, and also some of the strategies from Alex Quigley's book around the word gap to come up with what really is a metacognitive approach to reading comprehension in science. But I just think this is a really good thing to look at whatever subject you're in, because it's as much as anything how she approaches this as anything else. And the other thing that I thought might be worth looking at, worth watching, is a talk from Andy Samways about, you know, people that really can be brilliant at this scaffolding and removing the scaffolding are teaching assistants, and he's talking about using the framework that the EEF developed for teaching assistants to support students in classrooms where we're physically kind of distanced from them at the moment. Because that is the point, actually, that whatever happens over the next year, we know there are going to be times, unfortunately, where we're not all in the classroom together. And so just as a final thought, the EEF did do a rapid evidence assessment on remote teaching. And for me, it was quite interesting that two of the main conclusions from that was around making sure that the teaching quality is the focus, rather than thinking about how you do it. So that's thinking about all the aspects of teaching these things, the modelling, the worked examples and so on. But also in those really precious times where we do have time with children, with students, whether that's online, live, or whether that's in the classroom, really thinking about how we can develop this and support this independence so that when we're not there, they're much more able to call on strategies to help them. And so that another thing is to look at, there's a COVID support page on the EEF where there's a planning framework that kind of takes some of these metacognitive strategies and looks at how you might apply these within a remote classroom. So I have obviously gone right up to the wire with time, so I apologise for that. I've said any questions. I will stick around for a minute in case anyone has a burning one, but otherwise please do feel free to email me, or you can tweet me. Oh, I can see the chat is flashing at me. I will have a read of that in a minute. But thank you so much for coming. I do really, there's a really